The Federal Reserve defying Trump, voting to keep interest rates unchanged for the fifth consecutive meeting. But for the first time in 32 years, two Fed officials who voted actually dissented. They wanted the Fed to make cuts now. Now, that's hugely significant, as I said, because it's just something you don't usually see. 32 years, you'd have to go back to see dissents like that. President Trump, during a signing ceremony for a bill on veterans housing that happened before the Fed's decision, continued his attacks on the Fed chairman Jerome Powell and predicted that the Fed will cut rates at its next meeting.
This legislation provides desperately needed relief to veterans and their families who have fallen behind on their mortgages, of which there are a lot, because we have somebody that doesn't want to lower interest rates, and probably won't lower them today. I hear they're going to do it in September.
Dan Ives, Peter Tuchman, Einstein and Ives are here with me. So, Dan, fifth consecutive decision to not cut, but there was this dissent. Okay, what do you read into this dissent? First dissent in more than 3 decades.
Yeah. It's very significant because I think it shows even within the Fed, you're starting to now see a split because the view that, okay, it's time to cut. Powell's obviously putting a line in the sand saying not just no cuts, but I think even when it comes to September, it looks like probably 50-50. Look, this is gonna, this sort of battle, not just between Trump and Powell, but I think in terms of just the overall markets, it's going to continue to fester as we go into September.
You know, Mohamed El-Erian was saying the other day that Powell needed, that you were going to get in a situation where you can't cut because you look like you're caving, even if you think it is the right thing to do to cut, and then that is a big problem for the institution. And he thought that was the reason that Powell at this point should resign. Not because he disagreed with what Trump was doing. He just said that the situation we're in. You actually think Powell should have cut interest rates today?
You know what I do? We have dissent amongst the two of us here. We had dissent, you know, because, look, I think he didn't because he did not want to look like he was caving. But at the end of the day, he always talks about that the decision is a data-driven decision. And today, if you look into the nooks and crannies of the situation, GDP came out today, right? From 2.4 to 3, that's a big move, right? That shows there is growth, right? The fear about cutting before was that there'd be stagflation. If we were going to cut during a lower, slow growth environment.
But if you're growing with rates high, you don't need to cut growth to spark growth.
But you know, but everything's set up today. It would. He disagrees with me, but I think it could have been a great pivot for him to go, you know what? These things are setting up for an opportunity for me to do it, and I'm going to do it. I thought it would have showed strength, not weakness.
I agree with a lot of what he's saying. I just think the signaling about a potential cut in September, that's really what the market wanted. But look,
and he didn't give us that.
And he didn't give it.
Exactly. That was disappointing. Because if he's not going to cut, that's
fine.
Well,
the odds of a cut in September actually went down.
Well, it went down over
really odd,
from over 60 to less than 50% as he started to signal that.
Right. Well, and now if you talk about the situation that we're in, you're in a situation where Trump's not saying they're going to do it in September. Right. So now, if they do it in September, he definitely looks like he caved.
And maybe he does another visit for the building, and you put the hard hats on as well, right? I mean, no, but I mean, it's true.
I mean, which I guess leads to the point of whether it makes sense to have him there, have Powell there at all. But you also have in the market, you've got, you know, Mark Zuckerberg got a lot richer. Right? Was it Mark Zuckerberg?
No, it was Meta. Yeah. Well, Microsoft and Meta both blew out earnings today.
Blew out. I mean, you're seeing jumps in stocks that are so enormous.
Enormous. When you and I were on the floor back in the day, you didn't see 50-point moves like that.
No,
it didn't happen.
and there were no companies that were as highly valued as these companies are.
They were not.
Okay, so it's like things are booming along, like everything's great.
Right.
But is everything great? I mean, you know, the tariffs.
I think everything's great.
I would just say, like, look, the tariffs also adds a huge X variable for the Fed, right? That's a big reason in terms of the circular argument, in terms of why Powell is sort of, you know, obviously hesitating. But look, no doubt, I mean, you are seeing massive growth when it comes to AI. And as we've talked about, it's almost a bifurcated market.
And nobody's looking, though, at the details of the trade deals, right? There's a trade deal, and the market says, okay, great, there's a trade deal, right? We can move along, right?
Correct. But we are not looking into the details.
The devil is not in the details, apparently.
But you know, while we were all focused about what was going on in the Middle East, it appears, right, and appearance is a big factor here, that there was a lot of backroom diplomacy going on, right? Remember when we started this thing back in February, deal, done, Lutnick and Bessent, right? And then we had that void for a while where nothing was done. And now we are checking off the boxes, whether they're done or not. You know, it seems like we're going in the right direction. Market seems strong. we are sort of flatlining at a record high here, right, for a lot of different reasons.
And also August 1st, look, as you get into Friday, that's the trade deadline. So now the question is, how hard is that deadline, and what the deals ultimately look like?
And I guess that my question to you, because you're dealing with, it's covering Tesla and covering Apple, right, at the heart of this. Does it really matter whether the deals are good or not good, or does the market just care that the deadlines were met and there are deals and they want to move on?
Well, it does matter, and especially in terms of what the big one is going to be in terms of China. I mean,
Right.
that's important in terms of from a supply chain and everything else.
Yes.
India is important as well. And look, it doesn't matter till it matters. And it comes down to right now, the market is viewing it glass half full,
Yep.
but it does matter, as me and Pierre have talked about, in terms of the actual details.
Right, and the detail, we will eventually, we will have to find out the details. I think that's going to be the next thing.
Economic uncertainty has the Fed holding interest rates steady, but with some dissent in the ranks. Is President Trump's pressure campaign working? This decision comes in the middle of a massive week for economic news, with Friday's fast approaching tariff deadline and a gross domestic product rebound that is spurring debate. CNN's Phil Mattingly is standing by to explain all of this. Phil?
Yeah, Jake, it is a flood of news and a critical week for data that is still pointing to a lot of the uncertainty that the Fed was talking about and meeting over the course of the last couple of days. Now, as you noted, the Fed maintaining rates where they were despite the intensive pressure campaign from President Trump and his top advisors. But for the first time, Jake, in more than 30 years, it wasn't a unified vote of the 12 members of the Federal Open Market Committee. In fact, 2 governors, both Trump appointees, dissented, appear to back some of the policy arguments, if not the pressure campaign, that the Trump administration has pursued. Now, Paul was asked about this very rare event, at least in recent history. This is what he said.
What you want from everybody, and also from a dissenter, is a clear explanation of what your thinking is and what are the arguments you're making. And we had that today. The majority of the committee was of the view that inflation's a bit above target, maximum employment is at target. That calls for modestly restrictive, in my way of thinking, modestly restrictive stance of policy for now.
Now, Jake, what Powell made clear is that he wasn't going to commit to any future rate cuts at this point in time because there is just still too much that needs to shake out, in large part because of President Trump's tariffs, as you noted, that August 1st deadline just a couple of days away and things likely to settle in the wake of that deadline. Powell, however, making clear, still views this as an early stage part of the process.
And Phil, this new GDP report shows the economy grew at a rate of 3% last quarter. The White House is touting that, understandably, but there are some complex details in there. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, the top line number is big. It is a very good number that beat expectations, but not unlike the first quarter number, which was actually quite bad. It was actually less than 1%, less than 0% in the negative. It's complicated. It's not quite that clear. And just as you couldn't decide that the economy was in a terrible place in the first quarter, you can't say it's necessarily thriving in its second quarter. If you take the median of the first 6 months, the economy grew at about 1.2%, growing but sluggish. And beneath those first 2 quarter numbers, you actually see mirror images of what exactly was driving it. And that was Trump's tariffs yet again. In that first quarter, importers were racing to import goods, which skewed how the actual GDP calculation is made, rolling up major inventories ahead of those tariffs, trying to front run things. In the second quarter, you saw the inverse start to occur as tariffs started to bite and exporters started to roll up their purchases as well. So how this shakes out in the months ahead, again, it feels like everything comes back to the idea of how are tariffs actually going to settle in? The Trump administration making very clear they do not believe they will have any of the impact on consumers that has long been feared, but there's still a lot that needs to kind of settle into the market over the course of the coming weeks.
Phil, President Trump's tariff deadline is coming up fast. It's just 2 days away. He's floating raising the blanket rate to somewhere between 15 to 20%. That's up from the current 10% blanket rate. What would be the impact of that?
What's interesting about it is the Overton window on this has shifted. Now, keep in mind, when Trump came in, 2%, a little above 2%, was the net tariff, U.S. tariff rate. As it currently stands, post-EU agreement and post where things stand right now, it's at about 17%, maybe a little bit above that, the highest since the 1930s. And yet that is considered a survive and advance number for people, or for the EU, for other countries that have been willing to make agreements. And by that I mean their economies can survive it, their producers can figure out a way to not shut down entirely. Now, there will be an impact, the scale of it, and probably most importantly, whether US consumers see it directly, that is still just very volatile at this point in time, and we're gonna have to see how it plays out.
All right, Phil Mattingly, thanks so much. Almost simultaneously, President Trump taking further action on tariffs ahead of his major Friday deadline, imposing new duties on copper imports and hiking his tariff rate on Brazil up to 50%. Let's bring in CNN's chief White House correspondent and anchor Caitlin Collins. Caitlin, Trump's deadline is just 2 days away. How many more announcements are we expecting?
Well, Jake, the question is really what happens on Friday and whether or not that deadline sticks, because obviously we've seen previous deadlines from the president change or be shifted a little bit further down the road. And so that's really a question of today. But if the president's view of this is an indication, he posted in all caps today saying that the August 1st deadline is firm, that it is going to stay that way. He wrote on Truth Social, and strong, and it will not be extended. Obviously, that is something that a lot of nations are on tenterhooks right now, trying to wait and see if that truth actually comes to fruition come Friday, because that has been the big question here of these nations as they've been negotiating. At times, we've heard they don't know exactly what it is that the White House wants or what the United States is seeking. The president has often made clear, Jake, though, in his talks and as these negotiations have gone on with several countries over the last few months, whether or not he's frustrated with them or don't think that they are doing enough. You just mentioned a slew of options that he took today. He also said he is threatening 25% tariffs on India on August 1st. That is just 1% lower than what they were on the so-called Liberation Day back in April. He went off on them for their trade barriers, for buying weapons and whatnot related to the war happening between Russia and Ukraine. And so that is a real question, Jake, because obviously that would have a massive impact as well. And so it remains to be seen what that August 1st deadline actually ends up looking like come August 1st.
And it's no secret, obviously, that Trump wants Jerome Powell to lower interest rates. How is the mood today at the White House with today's news?
No, it's not. I mean, Jake, when he was standing next to Fed Chair Jay Powell last week, he kept saying that he would do the right thing. And obviously, in the president's mind, he has made quite clear doing the right thing, in his view, is lowering interest rates. And obviously, they remained unchanged today. That's not a surprise to the White House. I was talking to officials this week who said that they were expecting them to not change, at least this time. The question is what happens going forward. And you saw Jay Powell citing in his remarks earlier today that there's a little bit of an indication of what the tariffs are doing to prices and to inflation, but he wants to see, is it going to be persistent, and what is the long-term effect of this going to be, especially as a lot of these deals and negotiations are still either yet to happen or being hammered out now. And so that remains to be seen. We actually saw the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, earlier today. I asked him if he had a response to Jay Powell. He did not answer that question, Jake, but obviously one thing the White House has collectively made clear is what they would like Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve to do here.
Let's talk about the 50% tariff on Brazil, if we can. We actually have a surplus with Brazil. Is this entirely rooted on the fact that there's a prosecution and investigation of a strongman, former president of Brazil that President Trump likes? Are we really going to be all spending more money on Brazilian coffee because Trump has a thug friend he wants to support?
Yeah, Trump says he's not his friend, Jake, but obviously we've seen Jair Bolsonaro at Mar-a-Lago. The president has a very strong affinity for him, thinks he is being wronged here in this corruption trial, or this trial that he's facing when it comes to the election and the election results in Brazil that happened. And what we've seen in the new president there is really pushing back on President Trump in a way that other world leaders have not been doing, especially when it comes to these trade negotiations and whatnot. And when I asked the president a few weeks ago, we were outside on the South Lawn after he had just announced what he was going to do with Brazil, why he was doing that, given that massive surplus that the United States has with him, because obviously with other nations, he has cited a trade deficit as his reasoning for putting tariffs on. He basically told me, Jake, because he can. Now, whether or not that ends up in legal filings as they try to challenge this remains to be seen. But obviously, it would have a huge impact, and it goes against the rationale that he had for inputting nations on other countries and making very clear it is about what is happening to Bolsonaro here.
Yeah, the United States has a $6.8 billion trade surplus with Brazil, billion with a B.
Yep.